All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. It is time for a little bit of Cold War action. And just to sort of recap where we've gone, chronologically speaking, we've seen the rise of the Soviet Union. We have seen the rise of fascism and then the fall of fascism, right? Fascism was defeated in World War II. World War II was essentially a war against fascism. So with Hitler and the Nazis being defeated, the Battle of Berlin, and then we get Mussolini being basically ousted by his people, and then we get America dropping a couple nukes on Japan. A little bit down the road from that, we have fascism over. It is done. And from that, basically, what emerges is two superpowers, right? We have America, who was established as a superpower beginning in World War I. And then we have the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union emerges from World War II as a superpower. And that was because of the success of the Soviet Union during World War II and also the successes of the 5-year plans of Joseph Stalin. You remember those? Huh? You should. Right? You should remember those. So those 5-year plans allowed the Soviet Union to make tremendous strides forward in basically becoming equal militarily and close enough industrially to the United States. And with fascism being defeated, the two World War I allies, the Soviet Union and America, were now fighting to see who was going to be the big kid on the block, who was going to dominate world politics. That's what the Cold War was. It was a war of ideology, and that's why we look at it here in Social 30. It is a war to see who would control the world, right? Both of the ideological systems wanted to dominate the globe, but there can only be one winner when it comes to the Cold War. So almost immediately after the defeat of the Nazis, there is a conference held in Germany in a place called Potsdam, and that is the Potsdam Conference. And at the Potsdam Conference, we see basically the Allies trying to figure out what the heck we're going to do with Europe, right? And that kind of starts the Cold War. So let's go through these questions one by one here. There's only 4 to cover, so this will be fast. So number 1 says, which ideologies were at odds during the Cold War? Which nations represented each of these political ideologies? Okay, so what ideologies are at odds? Well, number 1, you have America with its liberal and its democratic ways, and also economically speaking, they're capitalists. So Western liberal democratic capitalism versus totalitarian communism on the other side, right? Which nations represented these? Well, Western liberal democratic capitalism is the United States of America, and totalitarian communism, that is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the Soviet Union. Now, number 2, which 3 world powers were present at the Potsdam Conference? Well, I sort of alluded to it already, but you had Stalin and the Soviet Union. You had Truman and the Americans, and also in there were the British. Winston Churchill was present at the Potsdam Conference. And there's some very famous images of the 3 leaders sitting together at the Potsdam Conference. You have Truman and Churchill kind of sitting close to each other. And then a little bit further apart, you have Joseph Stalin. And that gap between, the Western leaders and the Soviet leader might as well have been, 100 miles, because that's how far apart they were when it came to determining what to do with post-war Europe, particularly Germany. Now, number 3 says, what did Truman and Churchill want at the end of the Potsdam Conference? What was Stalin's goal? Okay, so this is where we see the seeds of the Cold War start to sprout. So Truman and Churchill wanted open, free elections, right? Why did they want this? Well, they knew that if the people had a choice between Soviet domination or liberal democracy, what are they going to choose? They're going to choose liberal democracy. So they wanted open, free, fair elections. Simple for Europe, right? Now that they're freed from the grip of the Nazis, let's let the people have sovereignty and self-determination and determine what path they're going to go down for themselves. Now, what was Stalin's goal? And this is the second part of number 3. Stalin's goal was to basically create a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. And that would involve many nations of Central Europe becoming satellite states of the Soviet Union. So he wanted nations like Poland. He wanted nations like Czechoslovakia. He wanted Hungary, Romania, etc. And these nations that he eventually moves into become part of what we call the Soviet sphere of influence, which we'll see later on. And ultimately, they are behind what is known as the Iron Curtain, but you'll see that later on in the second video chapter. So on one side, open, fair elections, said Truman and Churchill. And on Stalin's side, he's like, nope, you know what? We've been attacked. We need a buffer zone. And then lastly, number 4, what was the outcome of America's Manhattan Project? And how would it lead to distrust and resentment between Truman and Stalin? And how did it shift the balance of power from the two major World War I powers? Okay, so 1945, right? The Allies are even with each other, right? If this is the Soviet Union, this is America, they're even with each other. However, both nations were racing for the atomic bomb, right? They both wanted to weaponize the use of nuclear fission, right? The splitting of atoms, in order to create a bomb that had tremendous destructive capability. The Manhattan Project was America's race for the bomb, and America does it first, right? In the Nevada, New Mexico desert, just outside of Las Vegas, America in 1945 successfully detonates the first nuclear weapon the world has ever seen. And it's one thing to have the bomb, it's another to be willing to use it. And America demonstrated a willingness to use it, not once, but twice, right? So they dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, and then they dropped a bomb on Nagasaki, Japan, and that ended Japanese participation in World War II. Now, how would it lead to distrust between the two former allies? Well, all of a sudden, right, if you're the USSR, now America is way, way, way ahead of you as far as their military might, and that worries Stalin. That balance of power has now been dramatically shifted into the favor of the United States of America. And basically, guys, we see this sort of one-upsmanship continue the entirety of the Cold War. All right, you should be moving on to chapter 2 here. Peace.